Good morning. So I just want to thank Dr. Ogana and the Homeless Children's Education Fund for inviting me to participate in this conference with you. Here's the thing about a keynote speaker. I'm not going to tell you anything that you really need to write down. This isn't going to be an intellectually challenging talk. In fact, most of what you really need to hear you probably already know. What I am going to tell you is about my experience in over 20 years in working with youth experiencing homelessness, youth marginalized, youth on the edges of our society. So this is partly story, it's partly anecdote, and it's partly research. You know, every talk has a backstory, and perhaps the best title for this talk would be just Lessons in Service. The sort of lessons in pushing the rock up the hill and realizing that more times out of not, it rolls back on you. As Sisyphus said, the real challenge is just continuing to push the rock up the hill. So what are we talking about when we talk about street youth? Well, there is no one street youth. Look, if you know a youth experiencing homelessness, you know a youth experiencing homelessness. This is a broad continuum of experiences that are not unique to the United States or Western nations, that challenge every country in the world. Our estimated numbers, well, they're really hard to come by. Best guesstimates are that there could be 150 million children around the world experiencing homelessness in any given year. Now, you can imagine how difficult it is to come up with numbers. And in fact, there's a lot of controversy here in the United States as to how many youth are experiencing homelessness. Part of the challenge to that is that we don't define youth the same way. We all sort of come at it in a different perspective. The other challenge is that youth experiencing homelessness don't necessarily want to be counted as homeless. We can't walk up on the street and say, wow, well, you look homeless, and a couple of you over there look homeless, and you just write those numbers down. So you can imagine the challenge in even coming up with a number. But here's the reality. If there's one youth experiencing homelessness, it's a human rights tragedy. It's a call for all of us to do something different. Now, the experience of homelessness makes its way into lives very differently. Some youth find themselves stuck on the streets. Some youth are in shelter environments. Some youth are in environments not suitable for a domicile status. Some youth are still with their families and living in situations that are desperately difficult. However we say it, whatever words we use, the experience of homelessness has many different perspectives. The typology, the naming of youth homelessness has been a course of study for about 20 years. We've come up with a variety of different names, from runaway to throwaway to youth on the streets. In Europe, we oftentimes refer to them as rough sleepers. Any way we look at it, it's youth who are marginalized. Perhaps the greatest typology that's currently available to us was developed by Paul Turo and his colleagues at Wayne State University in Detroit, based on a study called the HALO study, Homelessness, Adolescence, and Life Outcomes. And the HALO study told us that really there are three categories of youth homelessness: transient but connected, high-risk youth, and low-risk youth. And why this information is so important is it helps us to understand how to deliver services. If we can understand risks, we can sort of understand the supports and services that need to be brought to a population. But it's more than that. Because the issue is, it's deep in society. When youth are told to leave, when 50% of youth surveyed were told that their parents asked them to leave and didn't really care where they went next. When youth who are running away report extreme issues of duress in their lives, leaving foster care before they actually have been emancipated from foster care, leaving situations of severe abuse, sexual violence, living with mental illness, undertreated, underdiagnosed. Now, this study was done under DSM-4 criteria. The DSM-5 is now available, and DSM-5, all of us have a mental illness. So that study is actually, thank you, that's good. That joke usually only goes over well in doctor groups, but I appreciate that. We equally know that there is a significant burden of substance use and misuse disorder among youth experiencing homelessness. We know that life on the streets is extraordinarily complicated, and the survival necessary to make your way out of that experience sometimes draws people into rather desperate situations. We know that people on the streets are oftentimes victimized and further traumatized. We know that youth experiencing homelessness make up a broad continuum, and that certain populations are even more vulnerable to the experience of homelessness. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, questioning, intersexual, and two-spirited youth happen to be even more vulnerable to the experience of homelessness, with some studies demonstrating 20 to 40% of populations of youth experiencing homelessness self-identifying in a gender and sexual minority way. And then we know that when we dig deeper into the literature, there's even higher risk within certain populations. So how do we deal with this? Recognizing that there's no one youth experiencing homelessness, there's no one population of youth experiencing homelessness. We like to say homeless youth. There's no homeless youth. There are youth who are experiencing homelessness in transient environments, in tenuous housing situations. They're youth, and they come from a variety of different backgrounds. So our real challenge is to understand that this complexity requires an equally complex level of service to them. That there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Equally, to understand that this isn't going to fit on a perfect Gaussian curve. I'd love it if we could take this and just plop it right into a bell curve distribution. It doesn't fit on a bell curve distribution. And in fact, the axis is pretty broad, with youth experiencing homelessness in a variety of ways. From the tenuousness of being brought up in an environment where the main source of family communication is violence, to a situation where youth essentially leave an environment that's so dangerous that they know no other course but to head to the streets, to youth themselves beginning to have children. All of this is to say that behind this entire issue is a youth. Now, I've had the experience of working with youth now for almost 20 years. And what I found was that a child, a youth, is our opportunity, not our challenge. Sabrina came from an environment that was economically tenuous. Very early on, she was introduced to the idea that she could make money by selling herself. She kept telling herself that this is just one more time, I won't keep doing this. She left high school and she took a job. She thought this was a stable job that she could build from, grow from, find a future from. But the clients that she was seeing at night kept coming in during the day. And eventually she lost her job. She met Mark, and he seemed like a really good guy. He could take her from this. He could give her a future. But quickly, Mark's substance use, misuse, abuse escalated. And they were eventually evicted from their apartment. Yesterday afternoon, when she came in to see you at your clinic, you found out she was pregnant for the third time. Look, this continuum, youth. What do we call youth? Where do we define youth? Well, if we look at data, the United Nations tells us that youth is under the age of 24. Some travel agencies define youth as under the age of 31. Youth is really a developmental time. It's not a chronological time. And the greatest challenge that we as service providers have is to rethink the way that we approach youth from a developmental perspective, not a chronological perspective. So how do we understand this more? Perhaps the best place to understand this is on the golf course. No, I'm kidding. The best place to understand this is in the research of the Adverse Childhood Experience Studies. These studies tell us that the more a child, early in development, early in brain development, is exposed to violence and trauma, the more it actually changes brain development. It actually alters anatomy, such that the more you're exposed, the more likely you are to be vulnerable to substance misuse, mental health-related conditions, chronic medical conditions, the more likely you are to die an untimely death. Now, You might think to yourself, that's really interesting information, and academically it sounds really interesting. But we've done studies on youth experiencing homelessness, populations experiencing homelessness, to understand how ACE scores affect their lives. And overwhelmingly, people experiencing homelessness have disproportionately high ACE scores. Overwhelming populations from impoverished environments have high ACE scores. So children who are making their way into the experience of homelessness oftentimes come from very damaging backgrounds. Now, all of that is important, and it makes a big difference, but it also has a tremendous economic impact to our communities. For every child who elopes from secondary education, high school, before completing high school, it costs society anywhere from $1.7 to $2.3 million. For every child who's fractured from their home, from their environment, it costs society a life, a contributing member of our culture, our community. And in fact, it's estimated that annually 5,000 youth die untimely because of the experience of homelessness. So how do we think about this differently? It's all well and good that I've given you a lot of national public radio statistics. How do we think about this differently? And what does it mean for the work that we do? Well, perhaps the most important thing in my mind is to understand it from the organizing principle of trauma. It's a picture of a saber-toothed tiger. Saber-toothed tigers have been extinct for thousands of years. Yet, when I show this picture, many of you have a stress reaction. Your palms get sweaty. Your heart races. Imagine if the saber-toothed tiger were always in your life. Imagine if the stress that you had as a child, being brought up in an environment where violence was the main form of communication, where a threatening voice was met with a closed fist. Imagine how that would change you and change the way you see the world. Imagine when that trauma begins to overwhelm our ability to care for ourselves. Imagine when the flood becomes too much for our physiology to understand. Now forgive me for just a moment. I'm going to give you a little bit of neuroanatomy lesson. Don't worry. My wife says, people don't geek out on neuroanatomy like you do, Wayne. Keep it simple. So just for simplistic purposes, let's talk about the brain. The brain develops in a very predictable fashion, from the bottom up. The first portion of brain development is that portion of brain development that actually has to do with regulation. Temperature regulation, respiration regulation, blood pressure regulation, things we don't think about. You don't have to think. Okay, breathe one more time. Okay, good. 98.4, got to get the temperature up a little bit. No, these happen well outside of our conscious. This is the brainstem activity. The next portion of the brain to develop is actually that portion of the brain that develops early in life. This is the portion of the brain that actually has to do with emotion. Emotional regulation. Have you ever wondered why a 2-year-old becomes so startled at loud noises? Because they're wired that way. Their brain is wired toward emotion. In fact, all of our senses, sight, hearing, smell, taste, they wire directly into that portion of the brain, an area of the brain that's highlighted by an anatomical area called the amygdala. The next portion of the brain to develop is the limbic portion of the brain. And this portion of the brain is the portion of the brain that allows us to take short and long-term memories and connect them. It allows us to begin to understand cause and effect relationships. That loud noise, it's just a backfiring car. You don't have to be so frightened. At 2 years old, we don't know that. We can't connect those things. The last portion of the brain to develop, that portion of the brain that really doesn't develop until well into our third decade, highlighted by a portion of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, is oftentimes called the executive portion of the brain. This is the portion of the brain that allows us to begin to think like an adult, to understand consequences, to begin to chart a future. Now, in a normal brain, this development is pretty predictable. And the ratio is that most of brain development is in the higher cortical centers, those executive portions of the brain. And the emotional portion of our brain has less anatomical involvement. What happened to a brain that's been traumatized? That's been subjected to what researchers now call toxic levels of stress. Trauma. It actually shifts the brain. Such that the body says, look, that's great. I love the fact that you want to be intellectually driven in the world, but I have to protect myself. And every time I hear a loud voice, it comes with a violent fist. So I'm going to stay centered in the portion of the brain that allows me to take care of itself. Because that portion of the brain is a protective portion of the brain. It wires directly into our hormones. It wires to the portion of our body that helps us to react. React in fight, flight, fright, or freeze. Predictable hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis actions. The more a brain is exposed to violence, the more it changes. And in fact, you might think to yourself, that sounds good in theory, but here's a descriptive understanding. What you see in this slide is a 3-year-old brain. Both of the brains on this slide are 3-year-old. On your left is what will be considered as a normal brain. First thing you'll notice is the size difference. Probably also notice that there's 2 very different color patterns appreciable in each of these scans. Your right is an extreme neglect 3-year-old. Brain changes interfere with later function in life. Now, again, these things, they sort of sound theoretical. It's hard to fully understand how they make their way into our personal lives. So with your permission, I'd like to do an activity. Keynotes allow us to do kind of funny things. Now, 3 things. First, I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to touch anyone in the room. So don't worry. There won't be any kind of physical damage. I'm a reasonable-looking guy. I have a suit on, for Christ's sake, so I have to be somewhat reasonable. I'm not going to touch you. Second thing is, the only request I have for you is to close your eyes and listen to the sound of my voice. That's it. Just listen to the sound of my voice. Nothing else. Third, if you don't want to participate in that activity, there's no requirement. So please don't feel like you have to close your eyes. And in fact, for some folks, an activity like this can be very jarring, can be traumatizing. So I want to get that out first and foremost. First, I'm not going to touch you. There will be no physical harm brought to you. I promise. That I promise. Second, all you have to do is just listen to the sound of my voice. And then third, if you don't want to participate, please don't feel like you have to. Just keep your eyes open and participate as much as you feel comfortable. So if you wouldn't mind, those that wish to participate, just close your eyes. Find a comfortable space in your chair, as much as you can be comfortable in a conference room chair. And just listen to the sound of my voice. Nothing else. It's a busy Friday. Probably all have come from rather hectic schedules. Just relax, take some nice deep breath in. Just listen to my voice. Sort of relax into the chair, find some comfort. Just listen. No! 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 Yes. 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 Now slowly open your eyes. Come back to the room. For some of you, that was a very startling experience. In fact, for some of you, I bet your heart raced when you heard me say no for the first time. And maybe some of you said, what the heck am I doing in this room? I thought the guy said he was somewhat reasonable. For some of you, when you heard the first yes, you still had a reaction. And you said, wait a second, where's the no? I'm bracing for it, right? Still getting some sweaty palms. Our bodies are hardwired to react to stress. And the more that we're exposed to that, the more our bodies react in the predictable fashion of fighting, fleeing, being overwhelmed with fear, being frozen. Everyone reacts the same way. This is hardwired. This is the way we were designed. Yet the more we're exposed to no, the more no comes with a violence, the more our body can't hear yes. And in fact, what happens in the brain is something very significant. The clinical term is called pruning. And what happens is the brain actually says, if you don't use this portion of your anatomy, I will shed this portion of your anatomy. If you're not going to be put into a position where you can intellectually discern whether no means no or sort of no or this is a funny exercise, then I'm going to protect you and I'm going to ensure that you can run, that you can fight your way out of this experience, that you can protect so that you can grow. And in fact, studies have shown us that the more an organism is exposed to violence, the more it alters brain development. Now, the hippocampus is an important portion of the brain. This is a portion of the brain that allows us to truly link short and long-term memories. So that no is filtered through an understanding of, I'm in a conference room, I'm with my colleagues. The guy's got a suit on, for Christ's sakes. It can't be that bad. The more we're exposed to violence, the more that hippocampus shrinks. Atrophies is the fancy word. And in studies that have been done on rats, the more they're exposed to violence, and in this particular instance, being submerged in cold water, the more the hippocampus actually erodes. We also know that running away and being in a tenuously housed situation impacts brain development on top of early trauma. So how do we understand this? What do we do with this? Well, the first step is to understand there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no magic bullet. There's no easy button. You can't take a program from San Francisco and plop it in Pittsburgh and expect that suddenly you're going to be able to provide the full spectrum of need for youth experiencing homelessness. The second is you have to recognize that youth come at service delivery from very different developmental stages, partly based on the trauma they had early in development. Early in my career, we started a program for really marginalized youth, and we began to realize that the youth that were coming in were not what we called youth. They were 27, 28, 29 years old. And they were seeking services in our youth program. And I was arguing with my administrator saying, I know we can only take care of youth up to 24, but these are youth. And what we began to realize is that developmentally they are youth. Developmentally, their minds have been changed because of early trauma, such that the way they operate in the world is very different than their chronological age. And this dissonance was the most important thing that we had to address. Because if we didn't address the dissonance, we couldn't truly serve them. So models have to be driven toward the developmental stage of development, not the chronological stage of development. The other thing that we've now been able to understand in research is that there's no one-size-fits-all, but there are some organizing principles for serving youth that are based on best practices. One, we are going to end homelessness with housing. But we will not permanently end homelessness with housing. We'll end houselessness with housing. We end homelessness with supports. And those supports need to be trauma-informed. They need to be motivationally enhanced. Asking people is a powerful tool. Some people just need a good listening to, not a good talking to. And they're strength-based. Calling out the strengths that people have used to survive through challenging times in their life endorses them as worthy. The next steps for service delivery in this community are unfolding around us right now. You're pulling together an enormous collaborative experience. And if I had to say one thing, it's that the city of Pittsburgh is so far ahead of the rest of the country because you've said collaboration is the key. We're not going to build a model. We're actually first just going to collaborate. And then we'll build a model from that collaboration. But we can't forget that youth need deep relationships. They need opportunities to reconnect with society, to reintegrate society. we can't forget that youth, by definition, is hallmarked by resilience. Physiological, developmental, intellectual resilience. And that we are hardwired to bounce back. Now, the pathways to this process are, in some instances, long, in other instances, short. The most important step is recognizing first that the longer a youth is exposed to a life of neglect or marginalization, the more traumatizing it is. The more trauma is introduced to brain development, the more it interferes with adult success. So our opportunities are great because we can empower the next generation of change makers by serving the marginalized youth of today. Sabrina is a real patient. I had the pleasure of taking care of her. Sabrina would come in to see me oftentimes with psychotic features associated with cocaine use. Her skin, she said, had bugs crawling out of it, and she would pick at her skin. Eventually, Sabrina got involved in very, very high-risk sex work. Eventually, she became HIV positive. As her life began to decline, she started to come in less and less. One period, I didn't see her for a number of months. And then she brought a note to me, and she said, "Look, I'm trying. This isn't easy. I don't know where I'm going to go with the rest of my life. But if you can continue to keep believing in me, maybe something will shift." We have to believe in the Sabrinas of the world. We have to move beyond the idea that there are objects of compassion to there are responsibility. The future is ours. What we make of it can be decided right here in this room. But the next steps are recognizing that trauma early in life alters the brain, interferes with function. And that youth who've been traumatized and are experiencing homelessness, they're injured. They're not broken. And we would rush to the aid of a youth who had a broken arm. We should be rushing to the aid of a youth who's lived through traumatic experiences early in their development. My hope is that someday there are no Sabrinas on the street. My hope is that someday Sabrina has an opportunity to find whatever she wants to do in the world. But it has to start here, right now. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you today. Like a lot of keynote talks, this is partly a call to arms, partly a request to understand the complexity of an issue, and partly a plea to consider beyond where we are now and where we can be. I hope the rest of the conference goes very well. I look forward to talking with many of you in hallway conversations. You're doing great work in the world. I know you are. I know the great work that the Homeless Children's Education Fund is doing. I know the great work of my dear friend, Dr. Withers. Tomorrow, it's a new day, and you are the change makers that will make it a new day for the Sabrinas of the world. Thank you very much for your time. For those that are interested, this is the academic literature that was cited for this topic. I'm an academician, I always have to show that. It's like the endorsement. I appreciate this opportunity, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.